So, colleagues, welcome to day 8. So my name is Jared Ungaro. I'm calling from the University of Nairobi, Kenya right now. So our talk this morning, the first talk actually, it's the only talk. So it's going to be on JSX graph to numbers and beyond. And it's going to be by Don and Jim from the Mathematics Education Support Hub in Western Sydney, Australia. Just housekeeping, please remember to put, let's all remember to put our questions on the extended Moodle chat for our asynchronous audience, such that we can be able also to follow on the talks thereafter, and also the discussions which went on. But of course, we will also be allowing some talks, some comments and some clarifications straight on live Zoom. So Don and Jim, please go ahead. The floor is yours and feel most welcome to the EAMS 2022. We look forward for your talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Jared, and good morning, everyone, or good evening as it is from here. Let me just share a screen with our slides. I'm Don Schumann. As Jared said, I'm a learning advisor in mathematics with the Mathematics Education Support Hub at Western Sydney University. And my colleague Jim Pettigrew is a lecturer with the Mathematics Education Support Hub. Over the last, I guess, 12 months, because I think Christian modified and upgraded the JSX graph extension for numbers about 12 months ago. We've been playing around with JSX graph as an extension to numbers and as a way to introduce graphical capabilities into numbers questions. We had been using GeoGebra a little before that, but we've largely switched over to the JSX graph now. So what is JSX graph? Well, it's a JavaScript library that's been developed at Beirut University, and a way of producing interactive graphics, not only in numbers, but in websites in general. So it can be used in any sort of general website, and we'll show an example of that later. It's freely available under Creative Commons license. Like numbers, it has a user community, and it's quite well documented, and it includes its own scripting language called Jessie code, which we've tended to use for most of the questions that we've created. The reasons that we've moved to JSX graph, I think the largest one has been the minimization of reliance on external systems. So using GeoGebra in the past, we found we were generating graphics in GeoGebra, which then had to load into the numbers environment, and there was a distinct delay in doing that. Where we've found that using JSX graph, which is effectively internal with numbers, it happens much quicker. It also means we're not reliant on another server. It integrates with the numbers variables and marking algorithms quite nicely, so that we can build questions with a lot of variation in them using the numbers variables. And we can mark based on what students do with the graphic elements. And Jim gave a talk about this at the numbers forum earlier. It's also possible to integrate, if you have libraries of ticks or other latex graphics elements, it's possible to import those into JSX graph and then overlay it with an active geometry or a movable geometry, so that you can reuse perhaps static elements that you might have. I think Jim will probably talk more about that later. And Jim, please interrupt me if you've got something to add, because as you may tell, we've really rehearsed this talk to the nth degree. I think we talked about it last 2 weeks ago. So we thought we'd show you some examples of the things that we've done with JSX graph and what we've found it's capable of. I'm sure we haven't even touched the surface of, or delve too much below the surface of what can be done. It seems to be a very versatile system, like the numbers system. So this question is a fairly basic example. Students are asked to move the points in the number plane. It's actually part of a multi-part question in the first part. In fact, what I'll do is show the question. So in this question, the students are asked to, first of all, there's a randomly generated linear relationship that's put in here. The students are asked to generate a series of y values, and then using the JSX graph in the next part, they're then asked to identify where they should go. So what are we looking at? 6, and that one is, no, I've got something in the wrong place. Oh, because that's at 4. So, pardon me, students can drag the elements there and then submit that part, and it's marked based on the position of the points in the JSX graph element. It's a fairly simple board. The script for the board is somewhere here. So basically, to create a board, you define a size for it in pixels. You set the limits for the X and Y coordinates. And in this case, we're using variables to set the Y coordinates. You'll notice it goes from X equals -8 to 8, but Y goes from whatever the max Y value is. That's a numbers variable. And then basically generate the elements that you want. And that's all there is to it. Within the parts in the marking algorithm for this part, we use a custom marking algorithm which takes the locations of the 3 points and then compares them with what they should be according to other variables that we've generated within the variables section. And something like that really is quite simple to develop, but it's a little bit different way of asking students to do these sort of questions involving linear relations, to get them more involved with what's going on rather than just the algebra. Where do I want to go? Back to here. Our second demo, we've sort of delved a little more into using JSX graph, and this is using variables in the Jessie code. Well, we've done that a little bit in the other one. Here we've done it to a greater extent, and using both numbers variables in the graphics, so that we're importing variables from numbers into JSX graph, not just reading back the JSX graph values into numbers. So it's a two-way discussion.
And also defining a function.
Yeah, and this is where the two different modes of working tend to come. So I've mentioned here with and without safe mode. Let me show you the two questions. So this question, students are presented with a graph. It's a trig graph of some sort, and then they're asked to identify which one it is. And if we try another question like this, we should get something that's a sine or a cosine curve as well. So the graph is being generated as a JME expression and then imported into the graphic. So we have our code here again, and we're graphing the function here. So function here is a JME variable or a numbers variable, which is being imported into the Jessie code to generate the function. Now, of course, one problem here is that these braces, if you're working with JavaScript, the braces are what are used to define functions and various other things in JavaScript. So if you want to use or integrate a function which you're defining in JavaScript, this mode doesn't work. And what we've found is, well, this is a different question, again, using a JSX element. Looks like a very simple question, but actually the JavaScript or the JSX graph part behind it is quite a bit more complicated. Because in this question, we're using some of the JavaScript elements down here, if I can find them.
Yeah. Line 57, yeah.
Yeah, line 57, we're defining a JavaScript function, which needs to be in braces. Now, in general, if JME reads this, it's going to assume that this is a numbers variable. So in order to stop it doing that, we have to put the script, the text into a JavaScript safe environment, which means that numbers doesn't scan this for variables. That's okay, but then we also want to move some numbers variables into the question, and so we have another string here which is using literals to take our JavaScript variables and take our numbers variables and put them into the JavaScript environment. So both ways are possible. It just takes a little bit of thought and pre-planning, I guess, to develop that. Jim, did you have anything more to say on this one?
Oh no, I think you've already made the point that what's different between this one and the first one we looked at is that here user input is being used in the marking algorithm, and there's also numbers variables being used within the Jessie code. So there's kind of two-way interaction happening with the variables and the JSX graphic.
Yeah, I think in this case, we're actually just, the student's just being asked to put in a number, so that the graphic is purely there for information purposes. But it's written in such a way that I think this triangle will change orientations if you reassign the question, as well as changing variables and which side students are asked to generate. And it's a fairly generic or a fairly standard sort of marking algorithm in this case. But again, it's possible to move pretty much whatever you want into the Jessie code and to use the JavaScript functions as well as numbers variables, but sometimes with a little bit of care. So that's the variables, or using variables. One place where I had almost a major crash with using JSX graph was I wanted to build some questions for a diagnostic test. This is one of them where the responses for the multiple choice were JSX elements. And when I did this first and I generated the JSX elements as numbers variables, they didn't appear at all. And after some frantic emails to Christian, the problem was that a JSX graph elements as a numbers variable is an HTML element, which can only appear once in the page. And since it has to appear in the correct answer area, it then isn't shown in the numbers question. So the way around this turned out to be to use the numbers, the JSX elements, not in the variables. In fact, the variables are just asking which function to look at, but the JSX elements are written as functions. And then we use a function call for each of the responses, for each of the multiple choice responses, to generate the graphs. So again, it can be done, and it works quite well. And if you want to generate graphic elements in multiple choice, it gives a way to do that. Is there anything else in that one, Jim?
No, that's pretty good, that one.
Okay. So that's some of our uses for numbers for JSX graph. The other thing that we've played around with, and Jim in particular has done some work here. So Jim, do you want to talk more about this? Is connecting TIX elements with the JSX graph environment.
Yeah, thanks. So I gave a talk. I'll put a link in the chat. I gave a talk, as you mentioned, Don, at the Numbers user meeting conference only a few weeks ago, perhaps months ago. Yeah, I'll put a link in the chat because Christian has kindly put the recording up and slides and various links to files as well that we used in the talk. So very briefly, I'll just, if I can share my screen, Don, I'll just
Sure.
I'll just show everybody some examples. We'll just jump straight to some examples. So what I've developed is a very simple workflow that allows you to take LaTeX generated vector graphics and ultimately import them into Numbers as SVG files embedded within JSX graph objects, and to sync up the coordinate system that you're using to generate the graphics. I use the library TIX, but I've also used PSTrix in LaTeX to sync up the coordinate system in whatever graphics generating library you're using in LaTeX with the coordinate system in JSX graph in Numbers. And so what that means, as Don said, what that means, I'll show you an example here. What that means is that you can take, this is perhaps not the most compelling example because it's not that complex, but you can take some vector graphics that you perhaps already generated in written code for in LaTeX, and I just happen to grab the boilerplate from this Stack Overflow page, and then just adapted it a little bit so you can see the code there. Put it into a template file that I've created, which is this one here. Put the TixEd code into this region, if you can see where my cursor is, compile to DVI, and then convert from DVI to SVG using this tool here, which comes with, it comes packaged with the LaTeX distribution I use, which is MikTeX. It would no doubt be easily found elsewhere on the web. So then you have your SVG file, then you can modify the SVG file if you need to. I use a free version of Adobe Illustrator, a vector graphics manipulation application called Inkscape. And then you can save that as a plain SVG file and import that into Numbers, and then embed it within your question as an image. So this is an image sitting within, and I'll show the code. This is an image sitting within a JSX graph board. And what this boilerplate, this template does is it also generates the bounding box for the image. So provided the image that you generate using TIX in LaTeX doesn't breach the bounding box, the rectangle that wraps everything up, then the coordinate systems will talk perfectly to each other. That is the TIX coordinate system with the JSX graph coordinate system. And so that enabled me and Don, mostly Don actually, when he was building this question, to add dynamic geometric elements to the static SVG file that we imported via that workflow. So the dynamic, I've got to put that in air quotes, the variable driven, if you like, geometry, which is basically the minute and hour hand. Okay, so that varies, you know, when you try another question, the minute and the, yeah. So these are geometric elements that have been added to the board, to the JSX graph object using numbers variables. And so it's really just overlaid on the SVG image sitting underneath it. And here's another example here. So this image of the syringe was generated using ticks. Actually, I'll tell a lie. It was generated using PS tricks, but it could easily be generated using ticks. And because the coordinate systems line up perfectly, I've been able to, you know, add these dynamic elements in the Jessie code. So, you know, this could have been all generated in JSX graph, sort of natively, if you like, without any need for this workflow. But one of the advantages of the workflow, I think, is that a lot of us who've been using LaTeX for a long time to generate graphics will already have a whole bunch of, you know, sometimes quite complex graphics that might have taken some effort to code and to generate sitting on the shelf, so to speak. And so this workflow would allow you to take it off the shelf and get it into numbers ultimately in such a way that you can overlay geometry on the graphic, knowing that your coordinates in JSX graph are talking perfectly to the coordinates you used to originally generate the graphic in LaTeX. Okay, that's all. I've talked enough.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I'll just share very quickly that the last example that we said to numbers and beyond. So we've also used JSX graph to embed some JSX graph elements into, well, actually into our learning management system via iframe. So this element is two div elements which talk to one another. And again, if I can bring it up quickly, I'm sorry, my cat is also deciding to get in on the act here. Oh, of course, that one's decided to go to sleep. So this is something that I took from the JSX graph wiki and did a little bit of modification to. It graphs the sine and cosine of the angle as you drag it around the circle in the second element. And to do that, basically, I've just written a web page and then dropped it as an iframe inside our learning management system. And that's also a way of getting it into a content management system. I've done the same thing with the university web page so that we can include dynamic elements within some of our math support pages. So that's a very brief overview of what we've done. Thank you. We're happy to take any questions, or if anyone has any discussion or thoughts on the process. Also be happy to hear of any other possible uses that you might think of for using this sort of geometric element in questions in the assessment.
Thank you, Don and Jim. That's also an excellent presentation. And I think many of us could join me in actually appreciating our speakers this morning, using the reactions on Zoom. So the questions, I will start with the ones on the Moodle chat.
Just as you're looking that up, just one thing I will mention in the presentation, all the presentation slides have links to the numbers questions, which have all been published. So if anyone wants to look at those particular questions, the slides are up on the EAMS site. Christian's put it up already.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so actually the first question this morning is from Christian, and he's asking, what will make the writing on the JS code in numbers more convenient? Is looking at whether you could make your function for plotting example to be more helpful for number questions variable, we automatically made a variable in the chess code. What do you think? Yeah, maybe if it's not, yeah. Is the question clear on the?
Yeah, I think Jim, have you got any suggestions? I think I found it reasonably straightforward to do. I think we did get Christian's help a little way in generating the function, making the function essentially a random variable. But
yeah, I can't. I've just started playing. This is maybe a bit off topic, but I've just started playing with using JSX graph experimentally entirely outside of numbers, so that I can kind of bring in buttons and other, text input and radio dials and other things like that. Other JSX graph elements, other JavaScript elements, to sort of enhance the interactivity of the JSX graph object, and I wouldn't mind sort of exploring those kinds of possibilities a bit more within numbers, because I'm not sure that Jessie Code would allow me to do that. So an example is, I can't show it to you, but an example is I've just been playing around with visualizing the R squared, statistic for simple linear regression. And so you can kind of switch on and off the sum, total sum of squared regression, sum of squared error, sum of squared. So it's all nice and visual. There's lots of toggles and buttons, and different visual elements. And so I'm combining the JSX graph object with all this other stuff around it, which is all in JavaScript. And so that'd be, if that is possible, great. I'd love to learn about it. If not, that might be something that could enhance the use of JSX graph within numbers.
So could you think of another maybe way to make the chess code more easier for maybe beginners or something?
Well, I mean, it's already, it's a scripting language, so I think that there's always a balance between using code and having control, and having syntax, etc., and an API that makes the coding task simple. There's in my experience with this sort of thing, there's always a cost. If you want greater simplicity, there's going to be a cost in terms of control, and it kind of goes both ways. If you want more control, there's a cost in terms of just you're going to end up with more complex low-level code. So I think Jessie Code is already a scripting language. As I say, I've been using the JavaScript language, the syntax, I suppose, API is another way of putting it, for JSX graph. That is lower level, but I have way more control. I feel I have way more control than using the scripting language, Jessie Code. So that's a long way of saying I think it's about right, is my take on it, Jessie Code. I wouldn't want it, I think if it were any simpler, then you'd be hitting some costs in terms of what you could do with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There's also a very good library of or a wiki of examples of JSX graph elements that's been put up by I think it's jsxgraph.org is the web page. So that's a good way to start. That one with graphing the sine and cosine of the angle. I started with something in the wiki and then made a few modifications.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Another reactions? I think we are free to raise up our hands on Zoom and we voice our questions also, our comments.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we can thank our speakers again for the talk. Thank you very much. This was really an excellent talk. Okay, so the next session this morning is actually on it's a free chat. I don't know what are the main takeaways or the main clarification some of you want to. We don't have something already cooked up for this, so we can cook, do the recipe here and cook it right now. So so the idea is something from the conference meeting, something you think we should spend some time discussing, and it could be just one theme or something. And yeah, so I welcome your suggestions right on the floor. Yeah.
Something that that I've wanted to find some time to talk about here. I was hoping that someone would put in a proposal about it. I'd like to talk about accessibility, if anybody has any experience or input on that. And I think it becomes particularly apparent when you're talking about interactive diagrams, because a lot of difficulties come up for students with motor impairments or visual impairments when you're trying to use interactive graphics. So actually, when working on the JSX Graph extension last year, I made a few enhancements to JSX Graph to do with keyboard only control, because it wasn't possible to move points around just with the keyboard originally. So I wonder if anybody has any experience of having to tailor their e-assessment material for students with particular needs.
Yeah, great. I think that's a good way to start. Actually, students who are differently enabled. So how do we tailor some of our materials, particularly on the graphics, such that they also benefit from what's going on? Yes, Chris. Good morning.
So it was just on follow up on Christian's point there. Christian, how do we get the info to students who have that requirement about how to control the JSX diagram with the keyboard controls?
That's a good point. We haven't given any explicit instructions on cases where we've used those, but it works through the normal tab index thing within the page. So a student who was just using a keyboard would eventually tab through the diagram and see that a point is focused, and hopefully think conventionally that I should be able to move this with arrows. But yeah, maybe we need to maybe say a bit more explicitly about how you can interact with things. I think that's actually a good idea in general, to if you present something interactive to a student, and it won't be a conventional interface sort of by definition. So you say what you can do with it. You can drag points, or you can focus them and move them with the keyboard, or you can, if we have other inputs, click boxes, enter numbers.
Yeah. So
Christian, would that be in the form of a script for a bot to read, or something like that? So that the question would sort of, introduce itself, if you like, to the user, and and kind of guide them through, care of a script that you have written as the developer of the question.
I would just put it as normal text. You can have stuff that is only read out by a screen reader. I think that's quite a common pattern for when you've got a particular mode of interaction that you would expect someone who can't see the screen to use. You would put a hint in. But when it's just keyboard only control, you're not necessarily using a screen reader, and you might just be reading looking at the screen. So
Yeah.
it just needs to be visible text, and that would also then be read by a screen reader if you're doing that. On the subject of screen readers, you can set up elements which are read out by the screen reader whenever they change, using the polite ARIA live setting. So you could use that to announce the coordinates of a point that you're moving, or something like that. It's really difficult to adapt a graphical interaction for purely screen reader use, though. So it's worth.
Is there such a thing as, this is maybe a bit out there, but is there such a thing as voice activated control? So you move A to 3-7.
I mean, maybe. Not that you could easily do within a web page, I don't think.
Because you'd need some interpreter, really, wouldn't you? You'd need a kind of a box that takes the voice commands and converts them into something that whatever application you're using could understand.
Yeah. So Tim has put in the chat a box to enter coordinates, and yeah, that's something I've done in the past, where if you need to put something in a particular place, you can either drag the point or you can just type its coordinates in. It's really about what you're assessing. If you're assessing interpreting written coordinates, then that doesn't make sense. But if it's just, where do you think this should go? You could take some written coordinates, but a graphical method might be easier for students that can do that. But certainly showing it helps make that link between coordinates and graphics. I think this is one of those cases where you shouldn't rely exclusively on one method. Like I always say, because I'm colorblind, I always say you should never rely exclusively on color to convey information. You should never rely exclusively on dragging a graphical element to make an input.
Yeah. I mean, are these ideas that are sort of still a bit embryonic for you, Christian, or are these ideas that you've already kind of documented and somehow formalized? I'm just wondering whether there's, because I mean, they're really solid and important ideas, and perhaps at some point, if they haven't already kind of crystallized, when they do crystallize, they should be somehow formally documented. This is the kind of optimal way to write a certain type of question, where you've got what you just said, where you've got a handful of principles involved.
Yeah, I'm just seeing if I have written anything.
Yes, if you want to encourage people writing interactive graphics with, say, Jessie code or JSX graph, then you could include an argument to the relevant function for the help. So every time you write it, you see that option there. And otherwise it gets lost, I guess.
I think someone earlier in the week or last week made the point, though, that students rarely read those kinds of hints. It's important to have them there for the student that needs them. Like, if you're stuck, you do end up reading things, but if you can immediately interact with something, you just sort of miss them.
I'm just wondering, I mean, this might be too much work and not necessary, but I'm just wondering whether ultimately you could be including prompts or guides, easily accessible instructions or outlines of these accessibility kind of principles within the questions themselves. Because I think otherwise they'll be somewhere else, and people will be beavering away building questions, and they won't look, and they won't, I mean, I'm guilty of this. They won't think necessarily of these accessibility requirements. But if there's something in the question where you can just kind of click a button, you know, is this optimally accessible? You know, some kind of little icon or prompt, then you can just remind yourself it's easily accessible. It's there within the question. I don't know. I just sometimes feel as though these important kind of considerations get abstractified away and kind of ultimately ignored.
Yeah.
I think Gareth,
Sorry.
Gareth puts it in chat. I think biggest trouble in things like that, like with any user interface development, is ultimately we can think about whatever, but it's only when you actually sit and observe 1, 2, 5, 10 students over the years doing that, you understand what's going on. I have to admit, in what it was now 4 years of lecturing, I had not had a chance to observe how they interact. There are definitely students with such needs, but it just didn't happen that I don't even know if I legally could ask them to demonstrate, but otherwise, in a while, I don't see those interactions. I have not seen anybody in a classroom doing a reader. So whatever I could imagine, it's just not the same. So the question is, are there studies, and what can we organize some studies?
Yeah. So Gareth has written
with an actual people using alternative versions of questions. Otherwise.
Yeah. So Gareth's question was, what sort of accessibility testing, including with real users, is built into the numbers development process? So far, it has largely been me reading and trying out using numbers with a variety of accessibility tools. So I spent a good few weeks going through numbers with just a screen reader and seeing how far I could do stuff. There was a team in Canada, BC campus, who did some usability testing of numbers with, I think, with blind students, maybe some other accessibility requirements, and they wrote a report, but they didn't make any contact with me when they did it. So there's some stuff that they just didn't understand, and so didn't, like, they stopped at the first hurdle of trying to set up a numbers question. So there was some good feedback there, and it prompted a lot more work, but I would have liked to do more. Last year, I tried to get some funding from the universities. There was some kind of fund that came up to run some proper sit-down usability testing sessions, and I didn't get that because they thought I should get it from the school instead of from the central university, which I don't agree with, because numbers is used right across Newcastle University. But anyway, the school has since said that they'd be happy to fund that kind of testing, and I'm hoping to do that in the autumn once we've got some students around. I think we might have to. We'll try and recruit some of our math students, but I think we'll also have to look around regionally to find some people with both the right access requirements and the right skills to thoroughly test numbers. So that's my plan. And Gareth, I know that you work a lot with accessibility testing as well. So if you can help me with finding people or situations where we could do some testing, that would be really good.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, e-assessment should be more friendly to students who are differently enabled. And I don't want to skew this conversation to another direction, but also in terms of accessibility in terms of the gadgets students use also should be like in my university, we did like a survey, and 90% of the students use mobile phones. So if some of the functionalities are actually optimized for a laptop or an iPad, then they would really disadvantage like students from these parts of the world. So so we should also look at this in a more bigger spectrum in terms of the system we build, and in terms of even the inputting answers. Maybe some of these like application like numbers, they should have like, I don't want to say a keyboard, but something which pops up, which makes the inputting of answers more friendlier or much more easier than it is.
That is a good point. Yeah, I have looked at how numbers looks on a mobile phone, because I'm aware that a lot of people do just use their mobile phone, and the layout I think I'm fairly happy with, but absolutely yes, entering mathematical expressions, finding some of the characters on a mobile keyboard is hard, and that actually would be a good reason to introduce something like MathQuill, which I know some of the Stack team are looking at as well. Yeah, it's something that should. The problem with introducing MathQuill is I think it's quite big. It would increase the package size quite a lot, or just have to be loaded separately and then introduce like an external dependency. But yeah, worth looking into. Konstantina?
So regarding accessibility, not so much about graphs, but have you noticed if you have like a Moodle question or a Moodle description box and you upload an image and you go, the image tells you to write like a description, it only allows 125 characters.
Oh.
I mean, but then if you reveal the HTML, it seems that you can write more, but I don't know if these two classes somehow.
In HTML, there's no limit on how long the alt text can be. So I guess knowing.
But if you go through the Moodle upload image thing, you can write more than 125 characters.
I would guess, knowing how Moodle works, that that's limited by the database field that's used to store it. So someone might have just fixed 125 characters at some point, and you'd have to do like a database migration to improve it. It's worth filing a bug with Moodle about that, because I think that's a real accessibility problem if it's so short. I'm going to have a look at that. Actually, I might file that. Let's make a list. So numbers, when you upload an image in the numbers editor, it does prompt you to write alt text, and I've tried to make that more prominent, because if it's something you do afterwards, it's very easy to forget to do. So does Moodle, like as you upload it, say write
yes, you can't save the image if you don't write the text now.
Oh, right.
Well, I think there is a box that you can click something that you say something that this image, I don't know, there is a message that you can click and actually not write the text, but it gives you a hint of that you need to write the text for people who have problems seeing or things like that. So what text you write there, though, it's another issue. I mean, you can just write figure, okay, and we'll accept it. And that won't describe anything.
Yeah, it's really hard to know what to write in those. My viewpoint on it is always, you need to write something that conveys the equivalent information that the student would need to get from the image. And when it's just an illustration, it doesn't really matter what it is. Like it's a picture of a penguin. You just say something like that. But if it's a function graph, you have to really think hard about which bits of information you're giving to the student and what is equivalent to what a sighted student would get out of it, what you're assuming in terms of their knowledge and how they could interpret the picture. A lot of the time when you're asking questions about interpreting pictures, that just doesn't really have an equivalent for a student who can't see. And it's not appropriate to even ask them that question. So yeah, it's really tricky to work out sometimes what to write in those, especially if you're limited in space.
I don't know, I find it hard. Like, I think most of the pictures I have are like, they describe something in the text and then they have the picture as illustration of what they already described. So already in the text, the function or whatever you have in the picture is sort of described. but not in all the cases. So
I'm trying to find, there's somebody has made a series of examples showing like it's sort of a train yourself thing about how to write alt text and how to make images accessible formats, and I can't remember what it's called. Give me a minute. I found it. It's the Diagram Center. I'll put the link in the chat. And as with the previous free chat sessions, I'm going to put the transcript on the Moodle site for anybody watching later. So it's the Diagram Center. And while I took issue with a few of the things that they say in their examples, it's just kind of like, what's the most appropriate thing to put here? Multiple choice. And actually there are, I would say, multiple valid options for those. But it's just, if you know nothing about writing alt text, then it's a decent introduction to what the general idea is and what you should be trying to do.
Often with, and I think we'll all see this, there's this kind of potential for a gap between, well, you know, the system allows you to make things more accessible, but the users, particularly hard-pressed academics who have an awful lot to do, don't necessarily either have the time or make the time or necessarily kind of have their instinct to go through and kind of do more to make things kind of accessible. And what you, I guess, we see more of across a lot of systems now is, you know, either more information there to help you kind of understand, well, how accessible is this? And kind of some amount of nudging to try and kind of get you to make things more accessible. I'm thinking things like, you know, VLE systems like Blackboard Ally, which will kind of give you a report, you know, not a brilliant report, but a report as to, well, you've got flat images here and you've got this and that and the other. Or, you know, if you're kind of in Word or something like that, it'll, if you put an image, it'll try and prompt you to put in some alt text, and we'll even do some kind of magic and try and kind of read that image and stick in a description of that image for you, which fails miserably with anything mathematical, but there you go. So, you know, there's certain amount of kind of like, you know, trying to more readily surface to you how accessible do I reckon this is, and also trying to kind of nudge you to, you know, think that this is something you should be doing. And I'm wondering, in areas like that, is there kind of potential for, you know, running some kind of, you know, obviously there are tools which would let you kind of run and say how accessible an exercise was against certain criteria, which someone could do themselves if they're using some tools, but could also maybe be built a bit into the system. And also, you know, prompts, and I don't know numbers very well, so apologies if it already does this, but if I'm adding an image or a diagram, is it kind of prompting me to add an alt text, or is it kind of passively waiting for me to go and see if I want to go and do that?
Yeah, in Numbers, when you upload an image, it asks you for alt text. But things like interactive diagrams, which are, I mean, created by an extension and created through code, it doesn't automatically tell you anything. That's a good point, that maybe it should say, like, when you're putting in some HTML into the page, it should maybe prompt you, check this is accessible. We do have some stuff in the documentation about accessibility and how to make sure that things are accessible. But you're right that if you rely on users to go and look at that and understand it and do it themselves, they often don't. And the best case really is when it just happens for them.
Yeah, I have seen things like offering tools which would, you know, when I was packaging up a SCORM pack or something like that, would at that stage kind of have a skim through and kind of, you know, give me some information, you know, to the effect of, just so you know, you have images without alt text, and you have this and you have that and the other, and that might be fine given the nature of the exercise or the nature of the material or whatever, but you might want to go and think about what you did with that. So, you know, those are things I've seen out there.
Yeah, I suppose I haven't really thought about this because I never do too much with the formatting of text, which is the kind of stuff that could be picked up by automatic tools. But I know that other people do really go wild with underlining things and bold and colors and text sizes. And there it would be helpful for the system to point out that, hey, this text is really tiny or there's really bad contrast. Yeah, I'll have a think about that. I'll see if there's anything that I could easily put in that would make it flag up that you're doing something potentially not good.
Just on the point of the interactive diagrams, is it possible to put numbers, variables into the alt text?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just not something I've ever tried to do, and I was just wondering if that was possible so that at least the diagram could reflect the variables that are being used.
I've said that it's possible. I'll check that it's convenient. I'll check that it, yeah, I'll check that variables are subbed into alt text for images, certainly, and for actually for creating JSX graph things, I don't think does the function take a description? Yeah, it does take a description, doesn't it? So that would get variables subbed in straight away.
Okay.
I suppose very briefly, because I know we're coming to the end, I suppose one question would be, which I know is something my colleague Lillian, who does a lot in this area, kind of is understanding what is the reality out in maths departments, engineering departments, in terms of how needs need to be managed. I mean, obviously there's a certain threshold of accessibility that systems need to hit, but I know that in our experience, you know, if a student has certain needs, we very quickly hit a threshold where, well, what we need to do is print this out, or else what they need is someone to support and kind of help them very closely with that, because that's just the nature of the institutional arrangements we've put in place. And, you know, numbers is good by comparison to other systems, that you do have that kind of print option there. So I suppose it's one of those areas where it'd be interesting to, especially for me coming a little bit outside of the kind of immediate kind of maths teaching sector, to know, well, you know, is there a limit to what we can do technically, because that's just not how students are supported in institutions in certain areas with some of these materials. And it'd be, you know, interesting to get a sense of people's experience across different institutions in that area.
Yeah, that's a really good one, Gareth, and I think would take a long time to respond to. Would you mind putting that as a question on the Moodle site, and we can write some responses?
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, thank you. I think it's exactly. It's, I don't want to say 12 because Nairobi is 12, but it's exactly 10 a.m. UK time. Please, just as a reminder, we continue this conversation with a couple of talks in the afternoon. That is 1600 UK time. And there will be 2 talks. Please just bookmark your calendar and hope to see you there. I don't want to take much time. I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, Jim and Don, for the wonderful talk, and everyone for contributing in the free chat. And please don't forget, Gareth is going to put the question on the Moodle, and let's all put up our contributions. Thank you, and see you in the afternoon.